Picture this. You are standing in sand that has been baking since before sunrise. The sun is directly above you. No cloud, no tree, no wall. The air entering your mouth feels like it came out of an oven. The wool on your back is soaked through, but the sweat is not cooling you. It is just leaving. Your water ration is more than half gone. Men around you are stumbling. Some cannot open their eyes at all. No shade, no road, no rescue. These are Napoleon's soldiers, veterans of the Italian campaigns, some of the most battle-hardened infantry in Europe. They had taken Alexandria. They were marching to Cairo. They expected to win. The desert did not need a single weapon to defeat them. Not far from that crumbling column, in the same landscape, under the same sun, families are living, have been living for generations. No air conditioning, no engine, no emergency services. They are not enduring the desert. They are completely at home in a place that is actively killing trained soldiers. This is not a story about toughness. Napoleon's men were tough. Toughness was not the variable. The variable was something the French did not have, could not buy, and could not conquer. It wasn't equipment. It wasn't courage. It was a system. The real mystery is not simply how Bedouins survived extreme heat. Any strong person can endure heat for a while. The real question is how they built a way of life so precisely fitted to this environment that the heat, the thirst, the cold nights, the disorientation, none of it became a crisis. They had already answered every question before the question arrived. The French fought the desert. Bedouins had already negotiated with it. Start with the uniform. The French failure was not a failure of willpower. It was a failure of logic. A European military uniform in 1798 was a statement of power. Heavy wool, dense weave, dark colors. Impressive on a parade ground, devastating in a desert. Wool traps heat, absorbs sweat but blocks evaporation. The body's cooling system defeated before it begins. The brain keeps demanding cooling. The cooling never arrives. Water drains out faster than supply can match. Men collapse not because they are weak, but because the logic embedded in their clothing was designed for a different world. The French were dying from a category error. They brought European answers to a landscape that required completely different questions. Now look at what a Bedouin wore in the same conditions. Layers, loose, flowing, full coverage layers. To a modern traveler raised on the idea that less clothing equals less heat, this looks insane. It is the opposite. The goal of desert clothing is not to feel cool. That standard does not apply here. The goal is to stop solar radiation from reaching the skin directly, and to slow the rate at which the body loses water. Loose fabric draped over the body creates shade around every surface it covers. The layer of air between cloth and skin acts as insulation against the direct heat of sunlight. The same principle that makes a double-pane window more effective than a single pane of glass. Wind can move through loose weave, carrying some heat away. Sand does not reach the skin or the eyes or the breathing passages. The body's own microclimate is preserved inside the robe, not exposed to the full force of the environment. The robe was not fashion. It was not tradition in the decorative sense. It was a mobile shelter wrapped directly around the human body, wearable architecture. And what makes this more than a clever observation is the mechanism. By reducing water loss, the clothing extended the distance a person could travel before reaching a critical threshold. In a landscape where the next well might be half a day away or a full day, every hour of reduced water loss was survival arithmetic. The tent protected the camp, but the body needed its own tent. And when you understand the body-level logic, the tent itself becomes even stranger. Because the Bedouin shelter commits what looks like the most obvious mistake possible. It is black. Every instinct shaped by modern life says this is wrong. Black absorbs heat. Everyone knows this. A black car parked in the sun becomes an oven. A black shirt on a hot day is a mistake. So a black tent in the middle of the desert should be death trap. It is not. And the reason why reveals something profound about what desert survival actually requires. The Bedouin tent, called in Arabic the Beit al-Shar, the house of hair, is woven from the hair of black goats. The weave is not tight. It is coarse, loose, intentionally porous. When the sun strikes the black surface, the fabric does absorb heat rapidly. The air immediately above the cloth gets hot. Hot air rises. And as it rises, it pulls, continuously, automatically, using the sun's own energy as the engine. Cooler air in from under the raised sides and edges of the tent, which do not reach the ground. The tent breathes. The interior, sitting in deep shade beneath a convective current of moving air, can be measurably cooler than standing in the open sun outside. Multiple architectural and ethnographic studies have documented interior temperatures running roughly 8 to 15 degrees Celsius below the outside air. In conditions where the outside temperature is pushing past 40 degrees, that difference is not a comfort improvement. It is a survival margin. At night, when desert temperatures can plunge dramatically, because dry air holds almost no heat after dark, the same fabric shifts behavior. The weave contracts slightly in the cold, reducing airflow and holding warmth inside. And in the rare event of rain, the goat hair fibers swell, close the gaps in the weave, and shed water. No treatment, no waterproofing chemicals. The material is reactive. It adjusts to the environment rather than fighting it. This is not ancient wisdom in the mystical sense. There is no mystery here, no magic. It is physics and biology, embedded into a material through generations of selection and refinement by people who could not afford a wrong answer. The tent negotiated with the desert. It let the environment pass through it on Bedouin terms. But the tent, remarkable as it is, was not even the central battle. The tent was shelter. The deeper war was water. The French army understood water as a supply problem. Carry enough, find the river, resupply. This logic works in Europe. It fails in the Egyptian desert for a reason that is both simple and devastating. The desert does not just deny water. It actively steals it. Every hour, through sweat, through breathing, through the simple act of being alive in extreme heat, the body loses moisture at a rate that European military planning had not modeled. And the French had an additional problem they did not foresee. The wells along their route from Alexandria toward Cairo, the wells they were counting on, had been deliberately destroyed or poisoned, not by the main enemy army, by Bedouin tribesmen who understood the landscape well enough to use it as a weapon. The French arrived at wells expecting water and found nothing, or worse than nothing. When they finally reached the Nile, the response was almost as dangerous as the deprivation. Soldiers rushed the water. Some drank so fast after severe dehydration that the intake itself became life-threatening. The body under extreme water stress cannot simply absorb unlimited fluid in an instant. The French relationship with water in the desert was a series of catastrophic mismatches. From the march to the relief, Bedouins did not solve the water problem by carrying more. They solved it by losing less. The mechanisms were distributed across everything. The clothing that slowed sweat, the shade that reduced the need to sweat, the timing of movement that avoided peak solar hours entirely, the camel milk that supplemented hydration, the oral knowledge of exactly how far between wells a route required, the social networks that meant a traveler rarely had to guess what lay ahead. The survival question was not how much water you packed at the start. It was how slowly your body consumed what you had. And here is where the animal standing at the center of this entire system finally demands attention. Because the French brought horses, and the horse in the Egyptian desert was another category error. A horse is a magnificent animal, fast, powerful, responsive, built for speed and short-range force. It is also an enormous consumer of water in hot conditions, with hooves poorly suited to deep sand and no biological adaptation whatsoever to the particular demands of desert travel. The French cavalry suffered alongside the French infantry for related but compounding reasons. The camel was not a horse. It was something entirely different. It was a survival platform. A camel can tolerate a level of body water loss that would kill a human or a horse before they recognize the danger. The biology is genuinely different, with kidneys and blood chemistry specialized for dehydration in ways no European domestic animal shares. A camel can fluctuate its own body temperature across a range of roughly 6 degrees Celsius through the course of a day, absorbing heat in the morning and releasing it in the evening, which dramatically delays the need to sweat and therefore the loss of water. When it does finally drink, it can take in enormous volumes rapidly to rehydrate. Its feet distribute weight across soft sand without sinking. Its eyes and nostrils seal against storms. Its hair provided raw material for tent fabric. Its milk provided hydration and nutrition simultaneously. Its familiarity with routes, camels that had traveled a path before, would often move with more confidence than their riders, was itself a form of stored geographic knowledge. The caravan was not powered by speed. It was powered by biological efficiency. Human pace adjusted to camel biology, not the other way around. And that adjustment was not a concession to an animal's limitations. It was intelligence about what the terrain actually required. The French understood their enemy. They did not understand the landscape. But there is a deeper layer to this story, one that has nothing to do with tents, camels, or robes. The real survival system the French never had was not equipment. It was knowledge. And knowledge in the desert takes a form that looks nothing like a map. The French had maps, technically accomplished, carefully drawn, the product of European cartographic tradition. What those maps could not carry was the desert itself, the texture of it, the language of it, the thousand small signals that the land broadcast continuously to anyone trained from childhood to receive them. A French officer looking at the Egyptian desert saw largely sand, more horizon, the occasional rock formation, distances that shimmered and shifted in the heat until the eyes could no longer be trusted. The mirages were not a curiosity, they were a weapon. Documented accounts from the campaign describe soldiers marching toward water that was not there, redirecting columns toward sources that evaporated on approach, consuming energy and water chasing optical illusions generated by the heated air above the sand. The desert was not just withholding information. It was broadcasting false information to people who did not know the difference. A Bedouin child knew the difference, not because of any mystical gift, because of a language learned the same way any language is learned, by immersion, repetition, and the constant correction of a landscape that penalizes misreading. Dune shapes were not random. Prevailing winds create consistent orientations in sand formations. A trained eye reads them as a compass. The gravel plains between dune fields had their own textures, their own drainage patterns, their own tendencies to hold or shed moisture. Certain plants appeared only near subsurface water. Animal tracks converged toward sources in ways that, read correctly, pointed toward wells. The stars at night were not beautiful background. Ursa Major pointed reliably to Polaris. When Ursa Major dropped below the horizon, Cassiopeia took over the same function. Shadow angles told the time of day and, by extension, the direction of travel. Certain rock formations appeared on routes with the consistency of road signs. The smell of the air changed near water, near certain minerals, near vegetation that had access to moisture below the surface. The desert was not empty, it was a text, dense with information, stable across seasons, reliable across generations, but only to those who had inherited the reading of it. The French saw blank sand. A Bedouin traveler saw a surface covered in directions, and this is the part outsiders kept missing. Navigation here was not a skill separate from survival. It was survival. Knowing where you were, which direction the next well lay, how many hours of travel remained before peak heat arrived, which route was viable for the animals, and which would exhaust them. All of this was woven into daily movement, the way that reading street signs is woven into driving a car. You do not think about it consciously because it has been absorbed into reflex. The danger begins the moment you are removed from that reflex and placed in the same landscape without it. But knowing where to go was only part of the calculation. The second part was knowing when to move. The French marched on European military logic. Cover distance, maintain momentum, move from objective to objective at the pace the mission required. This logic had won campaigns across the continent. In the Egyptian desert in July, it was a sentence. The human body in extreme heat does not lose water linearly. As temperature rises and solar radiation intensifies through the middle hours of the day, water loss accelerates. Moving at noon is not twice as costly as moving at dawn. It is several times as costly because the body is fighting harder to maintain its core temperature, sweating more aggressively, exhausting its reserves faster. A march that consumes manageable water over 8 hours of dawn to mid-morning movement can consume the same reserves in 3 hours at midday. The arithmetic is punishing and unforgiving and has nothing to do with effort or willpower. Bedouin movement timing was built around arithmetic. Dawn travel, when the air was cooler and the sand had released some of the previous day's stored heat. Evening travel, when temperatures dropped and the light returned to something manageable. Night travel, when stars made navigation possible, animals were comfortable, and the body spent water at a fraction of the midday rate. And midday, the hours when the sun was highest and the desert was most dangerous, was not marching time. It was rest time, shade time, the tense time. To a French military commander operating on European assumptions, this looked like laziness, like inefficiency, like Exactly the kind of soft, undisciplined behavior that distinguished a modern army from people who had not yet learned to push through discomfort. It was none of those things. It was survival mathematics. Moving slower, resting longer, choosing the hours of movement by the environment's logic rather than the mission's urgency. This was how people and animals arrived. Pushing through the midday sun was how columns collapsed. There was also a longer rhythm at work, beyond the daily cycle. Bedouin migration patterns across seasons were not wandering. They were calculated. Grazing land that could support a herd in winter could not support the same herd through a summer without destroying the vegetation and exhausting the groundwater. Moving on before the land failed was not rootlessness. It was resource management across a territory too large and too variable to be treated as a fixed address. A group that stayed too long in one place created the next crisis. A group that moved at the right moment maintained the system that made movement possible. Now compare all of this to the French army's situation. Locked into supply line logic, dependent on wells they had not secured, moving on schedules driven by military objectives rather than environmental conditions. In clothing designed for a different climate, with animals unsuited to the terrain, and the outcome is not a mystery. It is an equation. But here is where the survival system opens into something that the physical layers alone cannot fully explain. Because even a traveler with good clothing, good timing, a good camel, and good navigational knowledge still faced a landscape with one final irreducible vulnerability: isolation. In the desert, a lone traveler or a small group separated from the larger network was vulnerable in a way that no individual preparation could fully solve. Wells could be dry. A route could be blocked by a sandstorm that moved faster than expected. An animal could fail. Illness could arrive without warning. And in any of those situations, the difference between surviving and not surviving was often the same thing: another human being. The Bedouin hospitality system is one of the most documented and discussed aspects of the culture, and it is also one of the most consistently misunderstood by outsiders, who tend to see it as generosity, or virtue, or a charming cultural tradition. It was all of those things. It was also something harder and more precise. It was infrastructure. There were no hotels, no police stations within reach, no emergency services, no permanent roads carrying predictable traffic. A stranger appearing at a Bedouin camp in the open desert was not in a social situation. He was in a survival situation. And so, in a different sense, was the host. The rule was documented across the region and across centuries of travel accounts. A guest arriving at a camp was offered water, food, and protection, without question, for 3 days. The guest's identity, tribe, or even status as a potential enemy did not immediately change this. The obligation was prior to all of that. It was prior because the logic demanded it. A traveler carries information. He knows where he last saw water, and whether it was clean. He knows which routes he crossed, and whether they were passable. He knows where a sandstorm hit, and from which direction. He knows which tribal groups he encountered, and what the mood was. He knows things that the host's family may need in the next week or the next season. Feeding and sheltering that traveler was not charity. It was intelligence gathering. It was network maintenance. It was a deposit into a social system that would pay returns the moment anyone from that camp needed to travel. And the enforcement mechanism was reputation. Reputation in a desert society without permanent infrastructure or written law traveled the same way travelers traveled, through the network, slowly but persistently. A camp known for hospitality was a camp whose members would be received with hospitality elsewhere. A camp known for refusing guests was a camp whose members could expect refusal when they most needed help. The social obligation was not altruistic in the simple sense. It was rational. It was how the whole distributed survival system maintained itself across a territory where no single location could provide everything anyone needed. A cup of coffee poured for a stranger was not a luxury in a landscape of scarcity. It was a signal. It meant, you have been seen, recognized, and brought inside the protection of this camp. You are no longer invisible in the desert. And invisibility in the desert, being unknown, unconnected, unreachable by the network, was one of the most dangerous conditions a person could be in. When you hold all of this together, the clothing, the tent, the timing, the camel, the navigation, the hospitality, what you are looking at is not a collection of separate clever adaptations. You are looking at a system. And the word system matters here, because the failure of any one layer did not simply reduce the overall effectiveness by a proportional amount. It cascaded. The layers reinforced each other in ways that made the whole dramatically more resilient than any part. The clothing reduced water loss, which extended the distance that could be traveled per water supply. The timing of travel reduced the rate of water consumption, which further extended range. The camel's biology extended range again, while also carrying the tent, which provided the shade that made rest possible, which made the next movement possible. The oral knowledge of routes connected the wells, which gave the range its actual limit. The hospitality network protected travelers between wells, which meant that route knowledge was not just individual knowledge, it was shared, corrected, and updated continuously across the whole community. The seasonal movement avoided exhausting any single territory, which preserved the pasture and water that the whole system depended on. And the reputation system enforced the cooperation that made all of it work across tribal boundaries. In a landscape where no other enforcement was available, remove any single layer and the others began to fail. Carry the wrong clothing and water loss accelerates, shortening range, increasing the risk of arriving at a well depleted, increasing dependence on hospitality, increasing the cost of every hour of movement. Ignore movement timing, and the same chain reverses in the other direction. Every layer was both a defense and a dependency. The system was not redundant in the sense of having backup options. It was integrated in the sense that each part only worked at full effectiveness when the others were functioning. The French had none of it. Not the clothing, not the shelter, not the animals, not the route knowledge, not the timing logic, not the social network, and each absence compounded the others. They were not simply under-equipped. They were operating in a landscape that required a completely different architecture of survival. And they arrived with architecture built for a different world. The irony is visible in how they described what they saw. French accounts of Bedouin life from the Egyptian campaign period tend toward a consistent set of misjudgments. The tent appeared primitive, a rough cloth thrown over poles. The robe appeared backward, excessive clothing in extreme heat. The pace of movement appeared inefficient. Slow animals, frequent stops, no apparent urgency. The hospitality rituals appeared like superstition or ceremony, social decoration rather than functional necessity. Every visible element of the survival system was read through a European framework and found wanting. Because through a European framework, every one of those elements was the wrong answer. They were not the wrong answers. They were the right answers to questions the French had not yet understood they were being asked. The sun is lower now. The worst of the day is behind it. The sand that was white and blinding at noon has gone to amber, and the shadows are long and defined. Somewhere out on the cooling ground, a black tent catches the last angle light along its edges. The fabric that absorbed so much through the day releasing heat now into the evening air. The weave that worked all afternoon beginning its shift into the insulating configuration that will hold warmth through the cold that is already coming. Inside there is a fire. There are people. There is the sound of an animal settling. There is coffee being prepared. Not as ceremony, not as tradition for tradition's sake, but because a traveler has arrived. And a traveler is always both a guest and a piece of information, and both of those things matter. The column that passed through this same desert did not understand what it was walking past. They saw cloth and sand and slow animals and customs that seemed to belong to a simpler time. They were wrong about almost everything they saw. The desert was never the problem. The problem was arriving in the desert with someone else's answers.